Welcome. This is CISLL's annual fall kickoff. As a reminder, CISLL stands for the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Language and Literacy. Our plan for today is to welcome you and sort of share some of our other plans for the year. Then we are thrilled to have a wonderful keynote presentation, and then we'll wrap up at the end. Quick introduction to CISLL and our team. CISLL as an interdisciplinary center is co-led by two directors. So one is myself, Dr. Allison Gladfelter. I'm a speech-language pathologist, and we are co-directed by Dr. Lindsay Harris, who is in the educational psychology program. CISLL has 3 special interest groups, and each special interest group has a deputy director. So our first SIG is on diversity and language processing, led by Dr. Julia Ogg. The second one is on second language learning and bilingualism, led by Dr. Freda Stutenberg. And last but not least, learning within the disciplines and across the lifespan with Dr. Melissa Klukas-Walter. We also are super grateful for all of our graduate assistants who help run this entire center. It is truly a team effort. So I will now welcome Dr. Freda Stutenberg to introduce our keynote speaker today.
I'm very pleased today to introduce you and welcome to the podium Dr. Xabier Granja, or Xabi, as he's known by everyone who's met him today. Xabi is an associate professor at the University of Alabama, a leadership board fellow, and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Modern Languages and Classics. He also works closely with the Artificial Intelligence Teaching Enhancement Initiative. His research focuses on historical crime, specializing in 16th to early 18th century Spanish peninsular literature, through a socio-historical perspective focused on cultural dynamics and tension. His work deals with personal identities in early modernity, the literary and socio-political implications of individual identity formation, and variations in moralistic literature. Xabi has also authored multiple monographic and journal publications, collaborates with local NGOs such as the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the Alabama Museum of Natural History, the Good Samaritan Clinic, One Roof, Schoolyard Roots, Turning Point, Tuscaloosa Safe Center, and United Way of West Alabama. In the past few years, Xabi has become interested in accelerating and enriching research in humanities by leveraging artificial intelligence tools to perform optical character recognition to digitize historical texts, thereby increasing accessibility for those researchers and scholars who are not able to travel to archives to access these primary documents. His work is incredibly interdisciplinary, working with faculty in Renaissance studies, literature, and computer engineering students. So without further ado, I'm delighted to present Dr. Xabier Granja.
Thank you, Dr. Freda Stutenberg, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, CISLL members, for having me and for inviting me here. So we're going to talk a little bit about mixing artificial intelligence and technology with the world of Renaissance and humanities. For the eagle-eyed, you might get a kick out of the title like I did, because I basically said the same thing 3 times with Renaissance, Early Modernity, and Golden Age in 3 different ways. So that's my little attempt at puns. Let me tell you a little bit of myself. Grew up in Spain, in the city of Bilbao. I'm an English major. Then switched to Spanish literature in 2007 when I came to the United States, did my master's and my PhD at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and then I moved 11 years ago to Alabama to my current job as a professor there. Working currently to full professor on my next book. This is a beautiful campus. These are the nicest pictures I could find. At the very top, that building in the middle, that's my building. So it's a nice building, lots of sun, lots of green, and the Hogwarts building, as we like to call it, because it looks like a castle. I am, by training, an early modernist. I focus a lot on historical crime and gender roles and how the law affects how people can use and have access to justice. This is kind of what I do. This implies that there's a lot of pseudoscience, and I say pseudoscience because at the time there was not real actual science yet, right? But this was treated as science, right? Much of my work is contextualized by the Hippocratic theory of humorism. If you have not heard of humor, basically at the time you had 4 humors, which were blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, and these were a balance. So if you had everything in a balance, you were a nice balanced subject, right? This still makes some sense today. If you think of the last element, phlegm, when you get a cold and all your pipes are kind of obstructed, that you are phlegmatic. You are sick, right? So you are imbalanced. Thinking of the first one, blood, when you get really angry and your face gets all red, you are sanguine. You have an excess of blood in your head, which is not keeping you balanced, right? Thinking of all these elements kind of got me always interested in blood, how blood relates to judicial processes, and how all of this then is represented in text, right? So blood specifically is interested because bloodletting started becoming a thing already in like 13th, 14th century. There's some fascinating documents that explain the origins of bloodletting. This is one of my favorite images for obvious reasons, because I do not understand I haven't found no explanations why society thought that your behind would be a good place to start getting blood instead of the many other ports that are much easier to access. So this is one of my favorite images for the 14th century, and you see on the left side that you have kind of like a more common, right, port, which is in your arms. Now this by the 15th century is going to get medicalized heavily, like it clearly starts becoming a professional thing. We still do bloodletting today, very limited of course, but it still has some therapeutic value. And I'm telling you all this so that then you'll see a little bit of what I do and then how all of this will relate to AI. By the mid-16th century, 1545 to more or less 1560, mid-60s, we will have the Council of Trent, specifically from 1545 to 1563. This is a series of ecumenical meetings where all over Europe, where basically Christians decide these are the rules of Christianity, and these are the rules of what a person is and what they should be, and how they will go to heaven and how they will not, and how you are whole as a person, right? So as you get all of this is being stipulated into law, because law is not separate from religion at the time. They are essentially fixed together. There will be many rules about how to behave. One of them is marriage finally has a sacrament, as you see in the title here, in the sacrament of matrimony, which is now officialized at this time. And they specifically say that marriage is something sacred, as you can read there. Like, therefore, considering promiscuous intercourse to be inconsistent with the law of nature. And you don't want to be unnatural because then you're monstrous, as they would describe it. So fornication, adultery, and other licentious excesses should be repressed by legal sanctions. Now, why do I care about this, and why do we care about marriage? Because the moment you step out of marriage, you are behaving in an unlawful way, and that means you're going to be punished. And the punishment is going to be exceptionally bloody in many situations, which leads to my judicial documents and what I want to work with them. So there's plenty of creative ways of killing you. Some of these that imply basically splitting your vertebrae, so that you don't just die, but you actually asphyxiate before you die. Fun times. There's publicly shaming you through the streets. If any of you are Game of Thrones fans, you remember the shame nun? The actress is now in Ted Lasso, right? Like this, what's it, Hannah Waddingham, right? Yeah. She became like a sensation with like shame, and then you have this woman who had basically broken the law, and she is being shamed in the streets. This is the luxury version, if you will, if you can believe it, of mistreatment, because usually other punishments historically would involve crushing you to death by putting literal weights on you until your body breaks, impaling you at the site of sin. So for obvious reasons, they are just impaling this couple who was unlawful as a punishment, or in other dramatic fashion, like suicide. For example, this is the death of Queen Dido. This is a very bloody representation for the 1500s. Like, it wasn't common to see so much blood. For us now, it's normal, right? Not at the time. In this case, Queen Dido, she was abandoned by her lover Aeneas, and then she couldn't deal with it, and she decided, I'm just going to commit suicide, which is a capital sin, and it's an obvious problem for Christians, right? So there's all of this context that I wanted to give you. I work mainly on all of these types of crimes and the gender norms that define these crimes and the laws that protect or punish them, right? All of this, as you can imagine, affects everything. It affects society, it affects religion, it affects politics, it affects culture. It's inescapable, right? And this is what all my classes and all my research is about, right? Because it affects a little bit of everything. So how do we relate all of this? The main point that when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking, okay, how do you teach this stuff? Because this is what I teach. And when Dr. Ferreira and I were in our graduate program 20 years ago, our director then told us, look, if you never have any issues, never talk about religion, never talk about politics, never talk about sex. Guess what are the 3 things that I always talk about? All of them. So I cannot avoid it, so I need to actually find a way to teach it. And this is when I started thinking how to approach this with the technologies that are starting to come out. So we're going to talk a little bit about using machine learning and artificial intelligence in our humanities classroom. I always say that I don't like the term artificial intelligence. I think it should be called alternative intelligence, because there's nothing artificial about it. It's very real. It just does not think like us. And artificial implies that it is human-like, and it is not. It does not think like we do. So as I was getting more comfortable with these materials, I joined a group that we have at the University of Alabama, AITEI, the Artificial Intelligence Teaching Enhancement Initiative. The point of this group is to not be sidelined by STEM and actually show the world that humanities is just as relevant with AI than sciences are, right? Because we usually are forgotten in the humanities by technologies, like, no, we're still here. We can still be very relevant and part of this conversation. We, of course, focus a lot on privacy, ethics, the legal frameworks, like the access to this technology, because usually it is the STEM fields that will get all the treatment, and then no one thinks of funding things for the humanities. And this has not just implications in academia and education, but also in society, right? Like who gets to be integrated and a participant in the coming AI economy. This is how you have communities in any city that are essentially abandoned. Kind of like today, if you don't have a phone, you cannot partake in society. This is no longer a luxury. You don't need an $800 phone, but you do need a smartphone, because otherwise you will miss opportunities in society. So the same thing is about to happen with AI, and so part of what we're trying to do is make sure that it is democratized, access-wise. So you probably are very familiar with many of the different generative AI processes, companies that they are. The most famous by far is OpenAI with their ChatGPT. That was the one that a few years ago kind of exploded. It is also easily the most advanced, not in everything. Anthropic actually is doing pretty good. Stability AI's, their video generative material is honestly just jaw-dropping. It's also paywall, so not as much access, whereas OpenAI is making it very easy to access. And then, of course, we have Google, Microsoft, Apple, who are doing their own thing. Now, usually when I talk to academics about AI, not always, but oftentimes I get the, like, no, this is bad, right? And I always bring it back to Google search 20 years ago. If you're around 20 years ago, people freaked out like, whoa, now you can just search for papers and no one's gonna ever write anything or learn anything. Is the academic essay dead? No, it's still not gonna be dead because of this. Like everything, this is just a tool, and it can be used for good or for bad, depending on whether you make a responsible use of it or not. Are there irresponsible users? Absolutely. But we also don't let our students plagiarize. So we shouldn't fear the tool. We should guide students to learn how to use it properly, right? A scalpel is not a magical surgical tool if I just like stab myself with it. You need to use it well. Same thing. So these fears are oftentimes about like generation of text. And I'll show you a couple examples just real quick. So why not to fear it? It is a mechanical tool that can definitely create a lot of content. That does not mean that it understands it. It does not. It does not predict text. It's guessing what the next word might be. There is zero rationality involved in this process. So when people tell you like, oh, it looks like it actually understands me, it does not. It's just really good at guessing, right? When you're really good at guessing and you don't understand, like an academic or a student who can tell you a lot of things but does not understand what they're talking about, what do you miss? Nuance. And there is zero nuance in this case. And I'll show you one particular very obvious case. This might be a little small for you to read, but in this example I'm asking, so there's the trickster of Seville, if anyone is familiar with that, right? This is the myth of Don Juan, who's a womanizer and has sex with all these women who should be punished by law, as we just saw, and he is not until the end. So when I ask it, and when I asked, in this case GPT 3.5 was, I asked it, well, how is this problematic at the end? Like, does Don Juan actually repent in the end? And GPT very confidently tells me that Don Juan refuses to repent. Not true. If you look at the text, it might be a little small for you there, but Don Juan at the very end, when he's about to be literally by the ghost of Don Gonzalo, whose daughter he has had sex with, drags him to the depths of hell. As he's being dragged, he says, let me absolve, let me repent, I want to confess. And he's like, no, not too late. Don Juan wants to. Of course, it's an empty gesture, but he does try. And there's a difference between trying and failing and refusing to. Nuance, right? And because that changes completely how you interpret the character. Not as a complete morally decrepit person, which he kind of is, but he does try to change at the end, and that changes how you perceive the character and the whole book. I'll give you another example, and this time for full generation. In this case, I had a long conversation with ChatGPT about several comedias, several short novels by Cervantes. And after we were talking about this, it got very confused, because I was saying like, okay, tell me, how is it that this particular story that we were talking about, in this case, Las dos doncellas, the two damsels, how is it problematic within the framework of a comedia? There is a structure that these plays use. And after like 6 or 7 interactions that I'm trying to figure out, like, can you answer about this. And it ended up telling me, like, I apologize, but it seems there may be some confusion. There is no widely recognized work by Miguel Cervantes titled Las dos doncellas. Like, well, then I don't know what I've published on and what many other authors have published on, because it definitely exists. And then it helpfully tells me, like, you know what, you should read the Don Quixote. Like, thanks. That's really useful information. So content-wise, it's usually good, but it can get very confused because it doesn't think. And this is what shows you that after 6 questions when we're talking about this specific novel, suddenly it doesn't exist because it's not thinking, right? It is just predicting, and it got itself confused. I didn't confuse it. It confused itself, right? Even though this is changing, again, a couple years ago, generation was very problematic. Now it's getting a lot better, especially with GPT-5 that was released a couple of weeks ago. 4 was already 4.0 was really good. 5 is better. Now we're starting to splinter into the fast model and the reasoning model. You probably have seen that kind of thing. This will get better eventually, probably within the next 5 years. But is it going to replace human rationing, like reasoning? No, and not for easily 30, 40, 50 years, because it does not think like a person. So I think there is no reason to fear it, specifically because, and this is where I have 2 messages for both students and professors. For students, no one is going to ever think for you. You need to learn to think. People will say that, oh, we'll teach you Spanish. I'm a Spanish professor. We'll teach you Spanish in your degree. Well, yes, I'll teach you Spanish. I'll teach you language, but it's not just language. I'll teach you culture. I'll teach you to think in this language, but I'm also teaching you how to process and make decisions in life. The university is still adult school besides what you're studying, right? So I'm teaching you to think. If you don't think and you outsource your thinking to a machine that does not think, you'll never know how to think. And that's step 1. And for professors who fear this, I tell them always, design different tasks. Because there are many tasks that you can design that cannot be fooled for now. That's the disclaimer, right? For now. For example, if I want you to be able to differentiate something like the structure of a play and how something is problematic within that structure, GPT does not know how to do that. 1, because it's not published in the internet. Eventually it will be, and it will have that answer. But then if you tie it to content that you do in class, like, well, we saw play 1 and play 2, and how these, whatever it is that you've treated in your class, how these play on each other, and then something in that underlying structure is revealed that is not obvious, it will not know how to do that. For 2 reasons. 1, it requires too much nuance, and we're easily decades away from that. And 2, the fact that it cannot think about something that is not there, because you've done it in class. It's not out there. So as long as you don't publish about it, it will know about it. It limits a little bit of publication sometimes, but you can publish about everything. So you have to be smart. You have to outsmart it in that way. I do really like to use it with my students as a teaching aid to check for the comprehension. If I send them an article, I tell them, like, drop this on GPT and ask it, give me 5 questions to check my comprehension. They might not be the best questions, especially if you go for specific detail, but for general understanding, it is quite accurate enough for them to use as a study partner. Like, can you answer these questions? How many times do you have students asking you, like, well, what's going to be in the exam? Like, everything is going to be in the exam. Like, how do you know if I understood it well? Well, can you answer the usual questions I give in class in my slides? If you can answer those, you can do this exam. I'm never going to ask you something that's not covered in class in our materials. This is the same. It helps you study. And by the same token, it helps you prepare classes, because you can also, as a teacher, prepare this. Another one of my favorite uses that I keep telling my students is to use this as a conversational partner. Now, we couldn't figure out the audio to work, so otherwise you would see this, but in this particular case, I was trying to code switch with ChatGPT, talking in Spanish and in English, and I actually asked it whether it knew what code switching was. It actually gave me a decent response. I wanted it to code switch intra-sentence within the same sentence, and it only did at the very end. Sometimes it's done it more. The point of this is not for me to just practice code switching. This is just how I speak in my regular life. I just keep going from Spanish to English, and my students kind of like think it's a tornado, and then they get used to it, and then there's no problem, right? But for them, it's a really good tool to talk, to have a conversation partner if they don't have another student to talk to. Well, figure it out with this, and when you don't know something, say it in English and then switch back as you can. This is what I do in my class. I would rather you jump to English and jump back than just not ask or not comment at all, right? If the code switching, first of all, I want to remove the stigma. Second of all, it's more productive for you as a student if you're communicating in both, and it will give you confidence for that second language, right? So this is a really good tool for them to practice without, I get that the image of the professor, I'm never in front of a podium when I'm doing this, but in class, I'm just moving around. So I try to not have that image of like, oh, the professor, like you're scared. No, but many will still be they'll have reservations. I totally get it. Practice with this. This is a tool. It's not the end game. Administratively, it's really useful, specifically when you want it, like, for example, for Excel. I live in Excel. I love Excel. And it calculates so many things for me. And oftentimes I don't know how to do it. And I just ask it, like, how do I calculate this? And it will give me a formula, and it will explain exactly how it works. I know more Excel now because of GPT. Did it do it? No. I still told it, I need this. How do I do this? And it's like having an assistant. This is what you need to do. Do this. Sometimes it's a little trial and error, but eventually it helps me do my job better. If you're anything like me, you might not be the best at formatting references. Some people are really good at those details. I am not. I will miss a comma or I'll miss something. I'm like, you know what? Check these references for me. Now, talking with Dr. Ferreira Sudenberg earlier, she told me, like, oh, it never works. For me, it does. So your mileage may vary, and depending on what you use. And the lesson here is the same. Do not just trust whatever it gives you. Always check it, but do use it to help you work through something. Right? It has told me, like, oh, you missed a semicolon here. Like, oh, that's what I was missing. Right? Don't trust it fully. Always check, but it can be useful for that. It can also be useful for finding references. It does make up books, though. So, again, you can't fully trust it. But I have found a couple of references that I didn't know about. They're like, okay, I'm working on witches and sirens right now. I'm using this and that book. Can you tell me about other books that are related that I haven't heard about that, could be useful? I've found a couple interesting books that way that I would have not known, right? So it can also be useful. Now, moving a little bit on the generative side of teaching for actual classroom time, I use a lot of image generation, a ton of it. Image generation was not very popular until very recently. This is 2021 when this started getting popular. This was a tool by Crayon. It is, as you can see, extremely hallucinogenic. Sometimes there are no depictions of the scenes that I want to treat in class because a painter 400 years ago didn't think it was cool enough to paint. So I don't have the material. So I can create the materials. 2021, with this tool, well, I did this last year, but the tool was old. I used version 1, and as you can see, the description below is what I'm doing. It's a particular scene where two women, noble women, are essentially fighting each other, not fighting physically, but like angry at each other because one of them gave the other one a gift, and the other one gets jealous because there's also dishonor implied because she is his ex-girlfriend, she's the wife-to-be, so it's societally problematic, right? This is a little nightmarish, what you can see here, right? I mean, it gives me nightmares, at least. It all looks very creepy. This was 4 years ago. Jump to today. First of all, you see the details clearly. Now, this works, right? Except it doesn't. Nuance. These women are fighting, right? Does this fighting happen at a church with swords? Like, it does not make sense that two women with swords would be fighting at a church, right? Also, there is no gift, and there is no man. So it's kind of like spot the differences, where you have to like figure out what's missing and what's appropriate or not. This was done by Imogen 4 by Google. Meta is an interesting case for several reasons. One, it usually defaults to cartoons because it doesn't really know how to do better, for now. Also, this is not what I asked for. The man is not involved in this plot. This is some kind of, they're dating. These women are dating. I don't know what's happening. There is no fight. There's no gift. So like, okay, again, nuance. It's kind of there, but it's not. Apple is really funny because I was like, I don't know what to do with this. So Apple will get there eventually. Not in 2025, but they will get to that. The best one is, again, OpenAI. Right? It's clearly by far much more polished. Are they fighting? Just look at their expressions. They're not friends. This is a much more nuanced interpretation of it is a social tension, and they are clearly fighting with their eyes. Like the looks they're giving each other. There are two gifts involved. An apple could have been considered a gift, and then there's that more modern version of a gift. There are many men, so I don't know who's getting the gift, but we got closer, right? So nuance-wise, this is a much more exact representation of what I was trying to do in class. It doesn't have to be perfect, but when you're dealing with second language students learning from a text that they might not fully understand, because that's always my problem. Like if I were teaching in English, great, but teaching in Spanish to English L1 speakers, did you understand what you read, right? So this will help me give it context. I use that a lot for many different stories. And all of these are representations of things that have no depiction. And now I have materials that I created and that my students created for different sentences. There's like a woman soldier. There's a woman who in the end becomes famous for her purity, and so they're celebrating her. There's a man who is a hypocrite who basically, whenever he cannot find his wife, he gets enraged because he thinks she's dishonoring him, even though he has dishonored her before. So these kinds of things that do not exist. And I can make it clearer for students by using this. Now, we're going to get a little more into the historical side of things. I work with many of these documents, historical sources, some of them printed, many of them manuscript, and I will get these to my students, which they don't love, but they also don't hate, because for them to read this is very hard. Usually I give them print, but I do give them some manuscript. It's a good challenge for them to be confronted with. So what happens with many of these readings? In this case, these are all judicial cases about men attacking women or vice versa, usually married couples. So in this case, Catalina was kidnapped and she was raped by Diego. And the description in this case tells us that they bumped into each other one night and he had his sword out, right? So he wasn't going to attack her, he was going to kill her, he was threatening to kill her. Okay, so as we're reading through this, I task my students to render this, and let's see if we can find something of what you understood. How would you render this, right? And it allows me to check for comprehension. So one of my students gave me this. And then we tweaked the prompt as a class, right? So does this image work? Well, is he chasing her, or are they like in a getaway escape? Like, I'm not sure if they're against each other or together. It's not very clear, right? Does it look menacing? Mildly, right? It's not. Again, it's not very clear. If you told me that these two were dating, just escaping the authorities, I would believe it, right? It's not very clear. Another student gave me this, where he was using the word threaten, like, okay, that makes more sense, right? In this case, we have the both swords, great. There is more of a tension involved, but this woman, she's not really in danger, I would say. Like, she looks like, come at me. And she already has her sword ready. So a little better, not perfect. Third attempt by these are groups of students that were working on this together, trying to describe the scene. In this case, the emphasis was on the fact that the woman was trying to defend herself. So, clear tension, clear attack. She is trying to, I mean, it's a weak defense, but there's the gesture is there. My favorite part is that, I don't know, it's because they said that this was also in Spain, but I don't know if it's happy hour, but she's just drinking her carajillo or her like vino, whatever it is, and like, I don't know why, but okay, sure, it can still work. This was GPT-3 a year and a half ago. Now this year I also tried Imagen 4. Notice how much more realistic the graphic is, but noting how fake the whole thing is. It's so static. There's no movement. There's like no expression. I don't know if she's impaled by the sword or the sword is next to her for some reason. No one's moving. It's all very dreamlike weird. They're realistic, not believable at all. No nuance, once again, right? And at risk of sounding like a broken record, let's go back to OpenAI. This is clearly the best representation of this. There is a struggle, there is a fight, there is the menace. She's trying to defend herself, and she's going to lose this defense, which is what happens in this scene, in this play, in this novel. So this is a novel it was a judicial case that was very similar to a novel, and we did kind of that comparison. So this is one. I'll give you another little case where Maria was, again, raped. There's a lot of rape in my research, by Antonio. And they tell us that this man was mistreating her with words and deeds, aka physical violence. And so she, after she escaped, because other people helped her, she was trying to get him imprisoned with the strictest punishment that the law would allow, right? Okay, great. First try by one of our students, this image fails already, right? Because it's not a male aggressor. There's two women that are fighting each other. A woman is accusing a woman. That doesn't make sense, right? So it missed it. It is a hallucination. It does not follow what we want to do, but hallucinations are still helpful pedagogically, because imagine that this is being used in class and we're all speaking Spanish. The class can point like, why doesn't this work? And the other's like, oh wait, it's because of this. And they're like, okay, so we need this type of character and this type of character, and that is still clarifying mentally the scene in the student's head. So the student group that thought like, oh, this works, and they're like, oh, that's why it doesn't work. And that oh moment seems like it's not that valuable, but that's what makes you remember, oh, that's what this scene is. And they will not forget that, because as usual, I didn't tell you, you realized. And that's the magic that you've experienced in class. When they suddenly get something, they remember it. Right? So it can be still very useful. Another hallucination that was not entirely useful. We do have the male aggressor and the woman. Okay, there is a male aggressor. However, does this look like a court to you? I mean, it's a court, but why are people fighting physically with swords in a court? Again, nuance, right? The group that made the better description was this. They introduced civil court. Like, okay, now, because a court could be an aristocratic court where they could fight, or they could sword fight. Civil court, that means lawyers and judges, right? Okay, great. And scribes. So in this case, you have this image that worked really well, and so it described what was happening best. Keep in mind that I'm telling you the context here, but when we're doing this in class, they've done this at home. They've read it at home, and so they have not had context from me until they give me this, and then we reviewed as a class, and it's fun when, it's a fun, this nearly got it, and it's like, oh, but this doesn't make sense, and this one doesn't make sense. So it's not a competition, it's more like what did we figure out together, right? And it's fun, lighthearted, and it helps them understand. The best part is that then this is super adaptable, because then you could do exactly this scene in several different styles. You could do it as a cartoon. You could do it as a hieroglyph. You could do it as Art Deco. You could do it in abstract style. You could do it as a video game with like health bars, because there's aggression involved. You could do it as like photorealistic photography. This is what I'm using now with my students. What I really want to use, it's hard, is text-to-video generation. And for example, Luma Labs does some really interesting things. All of this is generated with a similar prompt description. We don't have a fight, but it kind of gives you a little bit of situational awareness of what it could be, right? This is one that I love because somehow she morphs into him, and she has like sword arms, which if you ever watch Terminator 2, it might give you that vibe. This is where we are now-ish, well, where we are up to last year. At this point in 2025, we have Runway and then DeepMind, which is made by Google. Everything that you see there in the background, all of it is false. And it looks entirely real. The difference is, and you can copy the styles, it looks like an ad, or it looks like a YouTube video, like all of this is incredibly realistic. If I didn't tell you that this is AI, you would not know. I have a good eye for this, and it's like, there's no way this is AI, and it's AI. So we are there. The problem is that this is money. This is expensive. We don't have access to this. I could pay a lot of money myself and do it, but I'm not going to, because my university should provide the tools, right? So until universities figure out deals on how we can get these materials to use them, then we'll have access to this. This has many other implications that are more worrisome that I don't want to worry about now, of like, well, if I can't trust what reality is, then what's that going to do to our society? We're not here to discuss that today, because then we'll all get depressed. But this is something that we could use, but it does have implications like what's reality, what's context, how do we deal with that as a society, right? But that's a much bigger debate. But tools-wise, we do have the ability to not just create materials, but also just see how students engage, make them engage with, then we'll actually make them think more and better about what they're actually working on, right? So this is part of what I do in class.